In this video, I'm responding to Jacob, a Mormon apologist who apparently considers himself one of my biggest fans.
One of my favorite religious discussion channels out there is called Capturing Christianity. The host, Cameron Bertuzzi, is a recent convert from Protestantism to Catholicism. Overall, Cameron is an excellent podcast host and usually makes good arguments.
Now, I actually like Jacob, and I'd like to say that I was impressed by his video, but this might actually be one of the least compelling responses to my work that I've ever received. And that's kind of saying a lot because there's some pretty serious competition. So Jacob opens his video with a mix of flattery and frustration, claiming that I've straw-manned Mormon beliefs, only to turn around and confirm, ironically, that my description of Mormonism was pretty much exactly correct.
Yeah.
Before we get to my response, let me provide just a bit of backstory so you're not completely lost here, okay? Recently, I released a video highlighting a series of parallels between Islam and Mormonism, digging into some really fascinating and frankly disturbing similarities in their conceptions of God. So for example, both religions portray God with highly physical, human-like characteristics. Islam uses terms like hands and feet, while in Mormonism, God the Father is believed to have an actual, tangible body of flesh and bone, something Mormon doctrine does not shy away from. Well, Jacob saw my video and felt the need to respond, or at least attempt a response, opening with the claim that I've completely misrepresented his beliefs. All right, so now it is time for you to grab your dictionaries. It seems that Jacob has dusted off his favorite debate term, straw man.
So it was really disappointing to see him, like so many others, present a straw man version of our Latter-day Saint beliefs about the nature of God.
So as I say, Jacob opens by accusing me of straw manning Mormon beliefs about God, but the irony here is that just minutes later, he confirms exactly what I said, namely that Mormon doctrine teaches God the Father has a literal glorified body. According to Doctrine and Covenants, God the Father doesn't just have a metaphorical body, he has an actual literal body of flesh and bones. In Mormon theology, God is fully embodied, interacting with the physical world like any one of us.
Yeah.
So if Jacob thinks I'm misrepresenting his views in some way, why does he admit that God has a body? Now, maybe Jacob's complaint here is that I didn't cite everything that he thinks supports the Mormon heresy that the Father is a sort of superhuman, but one can state a view accurately without saying everything that the proponent thinks supports it. So just think about it this way. Jacob is not straw-manning the Christian view by saying correctly that it's Trinitarian. The real issue here seems to be Jacob's discomfort with the fact that I'm sort of confidently challenging his worldview. Instead of engaging with the critique, he throws out the straw man label. It's a lot easier to do that. And this is precisely why his response video stands out as one of the least impressive that I've ever seen. An argument that starts with a false accusation and then ends up agreeing with the very point it sets out to criticize. It's not really much of a rebuttal. And next, things get a little, weird, according to Jacob, at least. Apparently, if something seems a bit odd to me, I must think that it's false.
It's really odd to see a Catholic making the case that the restored gospel must be false because he thinks it's weird.
Here, Jacob claims that I'm sort of dismissing Mormonism as false simply because I find it weird. But that is a misrepresentation, a straw man, if you will, of what I actually said. In my original video, I contrasted the Mormon view of God with the classical Christian understanding. I highlighted how Mormonism portrays God with a physical body, which differs significantly from the Christian concept of an incorporeal, transcendent God. At no point did I say or argue that the Mormon view is false simply because it's weird. Moreover, for your interest and consideration, I will be providing new reasons later on in this video to explain why I believe that the Mormon view faces significant philosophical challenges. So you got to stay tuned for that. But let's be clear, like reducing my critique to a matter of personal taste is misleading, and it avoids engaging with the substantive theological differences between our perspectives. So next, Jacob schools me with a little lesson on the Old Testament.
Does Cameron not realize that the Bible also literally describes God's hands, feet, and other body parts?
And they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone.
So first, Jacob doesn't seem to realize that the passage that he quotes says no such thing. Like even the translation he used rejects the literal interpretation by using the idiom as it were, which is an idiom that signifies a figurative meaning. And notice how Jacob conveniently ignores like all of the evidence that refutes his view. So like St. John says expressly that God is spirit in John 4:24. And we know that spirit does not have flesh and bones, as Luke points out in Luke 24:39. Moreover, in 1 Timothy 1:17, it says the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, is, quote, the only God. What's like basically a double refutation of anthropomorphic Mormon polytheism. And then, for good measure, Paul reiterates again in Colossians 1:15 that God is the invisible God. And if that weren't enough, the Old Testament expressly says way before the incarnation that God is not a man in Numbers 23:19, which is another clear rejection of the Mormon concept of God. Second, did Jacob know about those verses? That question, honestly, it should be completely irrelevant, but it highlights his own personal cheap shots about my supposed lack of awareness of the passages that he cited. Obviously, whether or not I know every Old Testament reference is irrelevant to the soundness of the arguments that I'm making here. Personal attacks on my familiarity with the Bible are just distractions from the real issues. You'll notice that this honestly kind of becomes a trend on his part. Rather than directly addressing my points, Jacob goes to sidestep with personal digs, hoping that it completely diverts your attention. Jacob's attempt to question my understanding doesn't change the fact that Mormon doctrine claims that God possesses a physical body, a claim that my argument directly addresses and that the Bible refutes, regardless of any biblical references I may or may not be aware of. Third, I was familiar with the figurative passages that he cited anyways. I live personally in a community with many Mormons, and I've had one-on-one conversations where they reference these descriptions to argue for a physical embodiment of God. None of this is new to me, bud.
But to be fair, Cameron has admitted in the past that he's not really that familiar with the Old Testament, and apparently he's not really familiar with mainstream Islam either.
So here we go yet with another ad hominem. Instead of engaging with my actual arguments, Jacob tries to sort of cast doubt on my familiarity with the Old Testament and Islam. It's almost like Jacob's banking on the idea that if he just questions my knowledge enough, you might forget that he's still not really addressing the real issues. But again, whether I know personally every detail about these topics has no bearing on the points that I actually raised about Mormon doctrine. Honestly, it feels like these sections were kind of just thrown in to like pad the length of his video, or maybe poison the well. It's examples like this that make this response one of the weakest that I've ever seen. But then he's wrong anyways. I'll explain more later on, but lots of popular Islamic apologists, think Muhammad Hijab, Daniel Hakikachu, and the Muslim metaphysician, think Allah literally has body parts like two right hands and a shin.
We believe Allah when he states in the Quran that he created Adam alayhi salam with his own hands and that he is above the throne.
All right, what is Jacob's next move? Well, he pulls the old "you do it too" argument. But let's be honest, when you're saying hands and feet, there's still hands and feet in some sense, right? It's hard to get away from that.
Yeah, and biblical Christians have the same issue.
So here Jacob leans on a tu quoque fallacy, claiming that Christians have the same problem. This tactic is one of those that we see from Muslim apologists a lot, actually, and they can't really defend their view on its own merits. So they deflect by claiming that these other religions face identical issues. But nevertheless, I like truth a lot, so I'm actually going to answer his claim anyways, like I don't care. So does Christianity have the same issue? Well, no. We've already covered some of the biblical evidence that God is immaterial, but let's add a few more points just to make this even clearer. So in the Old Testament, 1 Kings 8:27 has Solomon saying, quote, "The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you," making it pretty obvious that God's essence isn't restricted to any physical form. Then in Isaiah 40:18, it asks, quote, "To whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare to him?" Underscoring that no physical image could actually represent him. In the New Testament, John 1:18 states, quote, "No one has ever seen God," while 1 Timothy 6:16 takes it even further, describing God as dwelling, quote, "in unapproachable light, whom no one has seen or can see," end quote. These passages make it abundantly clear that God is invisible, immaterial, and beyond physical form. So here's the thing, and this is one of the big differences. Unlike the Bible, the Quran has no direct teaching at all that Allah is immaterial or spirit. So as a result, some Muslim scholars interpret Allah's hands and shin literally, a debate that Christianity does not face. For centuries, rabbis, the New Testament, Jesus himself, the apostles, and early Christians understood these biblical descriptions of God figuratively. Well, at least that is until an American in the 1800s came along claiming that God was actually an embodied superhuman with flesh and bones. But so, no, the Christians do not have this sort of same problem. The tu quo que doesn't patch the hole in Jacob's argument. It only emphasizes actually how far his theology diverges from biblical tradition. So next, Jacob takes us into Islamic theology, but it's almost like he's trying to pull a little switcheroo on his own beliefs.
Mainstream Islam does not hold to the idea that God has a body, just like how creedal Christians don't either.
All right, so here Jacob claims that mainstream Islam rejects the idea of God having a body, suggesting that physical descriptions of Allah are interpreted metaphorically to preserve his transcendence, much like we see in Christianity. Now, he seems to think that this undermines my point about Islam depicting God with human-like features, but let's dig a little bit deeper here. So first, his assertion oversimplifies Islamic theology. While there are schools like the Ash'ari and the Maturidi, they do interpret the Quran's physical descriptions metaphorically. Significant groups like the Salafis take them literally. And honestly, there's really no surprise there. As I've already mentioned, the Quran never clearly says that God is spirit or an immaterial substance. And also worth noting here, there are more Salafis worldwide than there are total Mormons. So this view is hardly fringe. Now here's a dilemma for Jacob. Option 1, if he agrees with the Ash'ari and the Maturidi schools that physical descriptions of God are metaphorical to uphold his transcendence, then by the same logic, the Bible's physical descriptions of God should also be interpreted metaphorically. This option conflicts with Jacob's own stated view about the Bible. Option 2, if he insists that physical descriptions of God in the Bible are literal to support Mormon doctrine, then he must also acknowledge that Muslims ought to take the physical descriptions in the Quran literally. This option validates my original point that both Islam and Mormonism portray God with human-like features. Jacob cannot have it both ways. Either, on the one hand, he accepts the reasons that scholars give for metaphorical interpretations, which undermines his own theology, or he rejects those reasons, opting for literal interpretations, which confirms the parallel between Islam and Mormonism that I highlighted in my original video. So in trying to dismiss my point about Islam, Jacob actually exposes a contradiction in his own position. Before questioning others' familiarity with mainstream Islam, he might want to consider how his own views actually unravel his own beliefs. Jacob's next big point, well, he thinks that it's totally reasonable to think that God the Father might have a body like Jesus.
Is it really that crazy to think that, like Jesus, the Father also inhabits some sort of glorified embodiment?
So Jacob wants us to believe that God the Father having a body is no different from Jesus taking on flesh. But here's the key question here. Does God the Father essentially have a body? Meaning that it's a permanent, unchanging part of who he is? Or is his embodiment contingent, something he acquired? Let's examine both options, starting with essential embodiment. This is a very serious problem. So if God the Father's body is an essential part of his being, it's like a necessary part of who he is, he would be permanently limited by physical constraints. Think about this. A God who's confined to physical dimensions bound by space and location. Does that sound like an infinite, all-powerful creator to you? I mean, it doesn't to me. It's not at all. It doesn't fit at all. A God constrained by a body is just another finite being, almost like a superhero. And this kind of God doesn't fit the concept of a foundational reality that grounds everything else. Why would you worship a deity that is limited by the same physical laws that bind us? Now, one possible response for the Mormon would be to suggest that God the Father isn't truly foundational, meaning that he might depend on something else for his existence. But that would introduce a new set of problems. For starters, suddenly Richard Dawkins' infamously weak objection has purchase.
It's not helpful to postulate a creator, because the creator is the very kind of thing that needs an explanation. And although it's difficult enough to explain how a very simple origin of the universe came into being, how matter and energy, how one or two physical constants came into existence, although it's difficult enough to think how simplicity came into existence, it's a hell of a lot harder to think how something as complicated as a God comes into existence.
Who designed the designer? Where did his body come from? Who or what assembled the atoms in the form of God the Father? I'll wait for Jacob to give us a rigorous philosophical answer to these questions. Moreover, if God is dependent on something else, then he isn't truly perfect, because dependency implies a lack or a contingency that perfection cannot include. And without that type of perfection, God would be completely unworthy of worship. I'll wait for Jacob to explain why I should bow down and worship a superhuman who lives on another planet. All right, now let's consider the alternative. Perhaps God the Father's body is contingent as opposed to essential, something. So basically he acquired it rather than always had it. Now here, Mormon theology actually faces an even bigger challenge. Mormon teachings claim that God the Father was once a man who became a god, as Joseph Smith taught in the King Follett Discourse. But for this to work, he would have had to exist spiritually before becoming embodied, which is entirely absent from Mormon scripture. In fact, in Doctrine and Covenants 130, verse 22, it states plainly that the Father has a body of flesh and bones as tangible as man's. There's no mention of a prior spiritual state, which leaves a major gap in this doctrine for Mormons. Now, even if we could get past this very basic point, another serious issue arises here. If another God elevated God the Father to this state, it leads to a chain of gods needing other gods to achieve divinity, which is basically just an infinite regress of gods. But even an endless line of gods gaining embodiment doesn't explain why the series exists in the first place. Why does this infinite gods creating other gods setup exist at all? Mormons actually have no possible answer to this. By contrast, we don't have any of this in Christianity. In Christianity, Jesus' incarnation doesn't require an endless regress to make him divine. It's a purposeful, voluntary act. Unlike the dilemma in Mormonism, Jesus taking on flesh reveals rather than compromises God's foundational nature. So Jacob is left with a choice here. Either God the Father's body is essential, making him limited and unworthy of worship, or it's contingent, which leads to an infinite regress problem. What's notable here is that Christians don't face this dilemma when it comes to Jesus's body. So yes, it is actually crazy to think that God the Father has a physical body. All right, next up, brace yourselves for some really sort of airtight reasoning. Jacob's logic: if Jesus has a body, well, God the Father has a body.
You see, the current glorified embodiment of Jesus gets really awkward for creedal Christians when you put their own premises into a simple logical syllogism. Premise 1, Jesus is fully God. Premise 2, Jesus has a body. Conclusion, God has a body.
So here Jacob claims that Jesus' embodiment gets really awkward for us Christians, presenting a syllogism to imply that if Jesus had a body, God the Father must have one too. Now, Jacob was right, certainly right about one thing. It is definitely awkward, but not for the reason that he thinks. It's awkward because his argument shows a clear lack of familiarity with Trinitarian theology, which is a bit ironic given his earlier remarks about my supposed unfamiliarity with Old Testament depictions of God. In one of the most popular Trinitarian models right now that's sort of being propounded on the internet, it's called monarchical Trinitarianism. If you've never heard of it, you got to look it up. But in this view, only God the Father is God in the nominal sense, so like a named sense, while Jesus is God in the sort of derivative sense of being divine and sharing in the Father's nature as a person within the Godhead or within the Trinity. Now, it's right there also in the creed that predates Joseph Smith's musings by 1,500 years. Let's just look at it. I believe in one God, the Father. So if we adjust this syllogism that he originally presented to reflect this accurately, it would actually read, Jesus is fully divine, Jesus had a body, therefore God the Father has a body. But this revised syllogism is clearly logically invalid and it shouldn't concern any Christian. Contrary to his claims, we don't actually need to sort of twist ourselves into incoherent Trinitarian philosophy to answer his argument. We can just appeal directly to Scripture and early creeds, separating Jesus's contingent embodiment from the Father's transcendent incorporeal nature. So yes, things are definitely a bit awkward, but only because of Jacob's seemingly unfamiliarity with the classical Trinitarian framework. Finally, Jacob goes full conspiracy theory mode, claiming the Trinity is just a Greek-inspired invention from the 2nd century.
And so to avoid this obvious conclusion, they end up in the unbiblical tangle of incoherent Trinitarian philosophy, a post-biblical philosophy that was demonstrably created in the 2nd and 3rd century to make Christianity more appealing to the Greek intellectuals, who saw God more as a transcendent abstraction rather than as a glorified personal father.
So here Jacob reaches once again for his Muslim apologist cap and claims that the doctrine of the Trinity was invented in the 2nd and 3rd centuries as a concession to Greek intellectuals. But this is demonstrably false. The New Testament itself is filled with Trinitarian passages. Jesus expressly rejects Mormon-style polytheism by affirming that God is one in Mark 12:29. And the New Testament repeatedly affirms that there is one God in 1 Corinthians 8:4-6. Now, at the same time, it affirms 3 divine persons. From the baptismal formula in Matthew, where Jesus instructs his followers to baptize, quote, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, to John's prologue declaring that the Word was with God and was God, the Trinity is right there in the earliest Christian texts. If we want to talk about doctrines that were sort of invented later, we might want to look at some of the 19th century Mormon teachings, the ones where humans can become gods, rule over their own planets, take multiple wives, and populate those planets with spirit children. If Jacob wants to play the game of who invented what later on, he's going to lose. He's going to lose every time. In short, the Trinity was not a post-biblical invention. It's a doctrine grounded in the New Testament itself. The later councils and creeds didn't invent the Trinity. They only clarified and defended it. In short, rather than addressing the substance, Jacob relied on fallacies and sidesteps to try and avoid the real issues. But for a deeper critique, if you're interested, check out my video where I show why Joseph Smith's additions to the ending in Genesis 50 show demonstrably that he's a false prophet. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. And as always, Christianity, at least the version that didn't begin to exist 1800 years after Jesus and the apostles, is obviously true.